everybody in my circle because there's no way I could hold all that information. So I'm grateful. I'm really grateful. So good morning, Eileen Zimmerman.
Good morning. It's Babs?
Yes, it is, ma'am.
All right. Nice to meet you.
So I've been off and on reading a little bit about your story. It's a lot.
Yeah, it is.
That's a life-changing story.
It was, and it still is. Actually, you're right.
Let me, Jeff. Let's give some information about Eileen.
Yeah, page 2.
She's the author of the new book, Smacked, A Story of White-Collar Ambition, Addiction and Tragedy. It's a brilliant and moving memoir of Eileen's shocking discovery, one that sets her on a journey to find out how a man she knew for nearly 30 years became a drug addict, hiding it so well that neither she nor anyone else in their lives suspected what was happening. Peter was also addicted to work, and the last call he ever made was to dial into a conference call. And so now Peter was your ex-husband.
He was. We had been divorced 5 years when he died.
And you weren't, at that time when you were together, you weren't what you are now. You were social worker? No, you were.
No, I'm a journal. Well, I've been a journalist for 30 years. Yeah, I'm back in school for social work, so that's kind of a diversion from the path. But I'm still a journalist, and I was when I was married to him, and afterward.
Okay.
So Eileen, why don't you tell us the story? The backstory. How how you and he met, and what were the early signs? I mean, because not only are Babs and I have we been incarcerated for white collar crime, something that didn't happen to Peter, but could have.
Sure.
But I'm a drug addict and alcoholic in recovery for a long. Oh, before we start, I just want to say. I heard from Chris, our mutual friend, Chris Linus this morning. And
he was a great guy and a great attorney.
Yes, yeah. He gives a shout out, and he has backstory with Peter as well. Is that right?
That's right. They went to law school together, and they were both top of their class.
Wow. Yeah.
Smart guys.
So give us some background.
So Peter and I met in the late 80s in New York City, a different New York than it is today where I am. I was looking for a job, and he was an employment counselor fresh out of Cornell. And he did not get me a job because he wound up leaving and trying to figure out what he wanted to do with his life. But we became friends from that, and we stayed friends for a couple of years. And then that turned into something romantic, and we wound up becoming involved. And so we met when we were 23, and we kind of stayed friends and then became romantically involved up until we separated when we were 46. So a long time together. And Peter wound up going back to school when he was in his early 20s for chemistry, and he got a master's in chemistry. And I was with him at that point. I was writing and I was working. I had sort of decided I would follow him around, which for the reasons I outlined in the book, I think I didn't have a lot of self-confidence, and I felt like his career seemed like it was going to be the better bet. And I was a writer, and I could kind of go wherever and find work. So I followed him to the West Coast, where he got a job at a pharmaceutical company. We had gotten married. He did really well there. He decided he wanted to go to law school. We came back to the East Coast. We went to New Hampshire. He went to law school. I worked actually at Harvard Business School for 3 years as a faculty assistant and then a research assistant. And then we moved back to the West Coast, where he began practicing law, and he was a patent lawyer. And I think starting in law school, it became clear that that something had changed. And it's because I think of the pedagogy of law school, but also, and Chris knows this, Linus, as well, and it was incredibly intense and rigorous and all-consuming. And it was fertile ground also for substance use and lots of kind of excess, because you're so intense during the day and at night studying and everything else. You need to let go in some ways. So at that time, I was not in that same world. Although we were married, I was going to work every day, and I'm not a big substance user anyway. I have a glass of wine occasionally, but that's it. Mm-hmm. So all that said, we moved to the West Coast. And then I think when his law career began in earnest, something definitely shifted and he just became completely kind of, for lack of a better word, addicted to the work. I don't think it was pleasurable. I think he felt like he had no choice. He was going to succeed. This was the way to succeed in big law. He wanted to become a partner. He wanted the money. He wanted the prestige. And from that began this shift away from each other. And we had young children. And I think he felt like he had no choice in the matter. You know, he was kind of in this hellish world of big law where you are at the partner that you work for, their beck and call. And, you know, that's how it works. And over the years when we were together, I didn't notice any substance use necessarily, but that doesn't mean it wasn't happening. It just means I didn't notice any big change of behavior. Peter was always tired from working. Sometimes he would stay up all night working. And so I figured he just had to get stuff done and he was powering through it. Was he taking something to get through it? Was he doing lines of coke? Was, you know, very likely, but I didn't know. But then we separated. Peter wound up having a relationship with someone else. He had an affair. We were very unhappy anyway. And so that was the catalyst for the end of the relationship. But after that, things really changed. I think it kind of became this permission to go do the things he wanted to do. He used to say, like, now it's my turn. You know, I don't know what that meant because I was thinking, when am I going to get my turn? You know, we had 2 kids and I was with them all the time and I was writing and he had this intense job. But after that, he started losing a lot of weight. He went through a very stereotypical midlife crisis. He got a sports car. He started running marathons, and he did lose weight from the running, but he started losing weight really fast. And at first it was like, God, he's in great shape. He looks terrific. And then it became not so great. He started to look, you know, and these I outline in the book, all of these symptoms of drug abuse that I didn't recognize, like becoming very, very thin, losing his hair, bad complexion, kind of, had sort of this kind of manic up and down behavior. He could send you these long texts that didn't make any sense, and then he could sleep for 2 days. And he didn't make any sense with the kids. He wasn't showing up for things like school pickup, let alone showing up for sporting events or teacher parent meetings, things like that. He would lose his wallet 100 times. He couldn't remember anything. And it escalated and escalated, and he was very, very sick with what we thought was this kind of flu he couldn't shake, but a flu for like 8 months. And eventually he was so sick in the presence of our kids that they left his house and were very upset. And as you know from the book, I decided to go up to his house and take him to the hospital because I kept calling him and asking him to see a doctor. And all that said, I got up to his house and I found he died. And he was surrounded by drug paraphernalia that, in my shock, I didn't even see. I had to be told by the police that it was there. And he died of an infection related to injection drug abuse. So that's the long story of the story.
So in this story, I mean, you learned a few things along the way in this ordeal. I mean, you learned something about the percentage of attorneys this happens to. You learned something about how people can hide these things. Talk a little bit about your own discovery around what you didn't know and then what you found out.
About lawyers specifically or just in general?
Just both.
Okay.
How this became a bigger thing than you imagined.
Right. Well, at the house when Peter died, the police came and the medical examiner and the EMT people. And I asked, and when the medical examiner said, we think it was an overdose at the time, that's what they thought. She said he had injection marks all over his body. I was like, you got to be kidding. This guy is like wealthy and smart and white and living in this, enclave by the beach. And she said, we see a lot of this now. We see a lot of very successful executives that are dying of overdoses, and a lot of them are using amphetamines. And I thought to myself, well, there's something here that I need to look into. And so I did. And I learned that there were a lot of people that were in white collar professions that were really struggling from the competition, from the constant need to keep up with their colleagues and their neighbors, and also just the pressure to keep their jobs, especially as you get into a higher echelon, whether it's finance or technology or law. those jobs are more scarce. Those are the big prizes, and you are kind of ruthlessly competing. And that means working long hours and, constantly being at the top of your game, which may not physically be possible without some kind of hack, which is often a stimulant like Adderall or an amphetamine or cocaine or methamphetamine or something like that. And then, a lot of the people I interviewed would get home and they couldn't sleep. So they're smoking, cannabis, or they're drinking a lot. A lot of them are taking opioids or benzodiazepines so they can sleep. And then it kind of sets up this cycle where you're right. So now you're stuck in this cycle of use and abuse. And also you're building up your tolerance. And so what I found was there were a lot of very high achieving men and women, especially men, it seemed from my unscientific survey, but that's the people that I found, that were using substances to kind of keep up and also to keep their anxiety and depression at bay. So rather than going through the channels like seeing a therapist or a psychiatrist and trying to figure it out, it's much easier to just pop a Vicodin and figure like, this will numb me. I'll get to sleep. I'll start again in the morning. And I found a lot of that, which surprised me, I think, because I thought, here are people that seem to have everything, beautiful homes. Most of them were married still. They had healthy kids. They had a lot of money, so they could get what they needed in terms of mental health counseling and things like that. But I don't think they felt like they could. I think the feeling I got from a lot of these professionals was that to seek that out would somehow be failure or an admission of a weakness or a vulnerability that they were not going to show or that they were not going to admit they had.
Well, that certainly happened to me. The reason I was originally drawn to your story and your book was through the New York Times article you wrote a few years ago,
Right.
which was chilling for me, And at that point, we were already running a support group for people who were prosecuted for or convicted of white collar crimes. And the themes are it's the same theme, because caught up in this bizarre kind of characterless world, where rules go out the window, and for me personally, there was a tipping point where I knew that I was no longer living in kind of the life that I envisioned myself when I first became a lawyer.
Yeah.
Which was, I think, to do good, but that rapidly dissipated into this world of just wanting to get ahead and brinksmanship. And I was a trained combatant.
Oh,
And
that's a great phrase. Yeah.
And then that just led to where my ego was just so fractured. I just didn't have any sense of self. I became kind of a chameleon, whatever someone wanted me to be. And I pick up all that in your book and in your articles. So I don't really see a distinction between the drug abuse and the imperceptible slide down to judgment impairment, where someone might do something legal or illegal. It's all kind of the same. And
yeah.
So as a spouse or as an ex-spouse, how is it that you don't see it? How is it that it's so present, omnipresent, but you don't see it?
Well, I think there's a lot of being gaslit. I mean, this is a guy, for Peter, who was very smart and very skilled and a very good lawyer. And so if I would say things like, why are you 2 hours late to pick up our son from school when you're only 25 minutes away? He'd say, well, there was an accident. I couldn't get there. And I would check traffic and it would say there was no accident. And he would say, what can I tell you? There was an accident. And I think part of me felt like maybe it happened right after I checked traffic. And, why would he be lying? Like, I couldn't figure out why he would be so late, but it kept happening. And so I think things like that, where he had such a plausible excuse, or maybe even like a borderline plausible excuse. And in that way, I have to take some responsibility. I think I needed to believe that he was telling the truth, because, the alternatives were not things that were even in my wheelhouse. Like I wasn't going to think, maybe he has an addiction issue. Maybe he's struggling with this. It just seemed to me like, why would he do that? Like, he knows better. He's a chemist. he's not going to do something that foolhardy, but of course he is, and he's also arrogant, and he also thinks he's not going to be like everybody else, susceptible to these very powerful substances. So I think part of it was my own biases. I thought, this is not what an alcoholic or somebody struggling with a drug addiction is going to look like. He knows better, but really that's not the case. And so that was my ignorance. And also I think self-preservation. I really needed Peter. Our family did. I mean, I was a writer and he was a lawyer. So when I was making $45,000 a year, he was making, over $1 million a year. Although I wasn't aware that he was making that much at the time. He didn't tell me. I mean, he was very not transparent. So I couldn't live in San Diego without his help. And so I needed him to be okay. So I kind of didn't go to what should have been a very obvious thing. I went to things like, maybe he has bipolar disorder. Maybe he has an eating disorder. Maybe he's psychotic, things I figured like, well, you can treat that, but because I couldn't say, or maybe he has the flu. Maybe he has maybe it's cancer,
So how did you explain all this to your children? Like, what did your children make of all this? And then did you put them in some sort of therapeutic setting? It's somewhere in between all of this happening?
When it was happening, we were all going through it. It could not make sense of it. And some of it I didn't know until my son kind of revealed it toward the end of Peter's life, that there had been all this crazy stuff going on in the house. And, when you're divorced, you don't always know. My son at that point was 16. And I guess he figured this is just the way dad is now. And so after at the scene when he died and we were at his house, I think finding out that this was what was going on was both a relief, but also we all realized how blind we were to what was going on. And then after that, my kids and I did a kind of trauma therapy called EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. They're not quite sure how it works, but it's where at least for us, you watch a light go back and forth, and the bilateral movement allows your brain to reprocess traumatic memories. And so that really helped my kids process the trauma of losing their father in such a kind of, even though it wasn't violent, it felt violent and criminal. It felt like a crime scene, and we've, I think we've spent the last 4.5 years talking about what it means to have had this happen in your family. And there's a lot of shame and guilt. I mean, I think we all have survivor's guilt that we didn't see it and we didn't save him.
And what about your various communities? Now, all of a sudden, it's public. Dad's found on the floor with a needle in his arm or close to it, and like, what's the wreckage? I mean, how does it affect everybody's relationship with their various communities? Are people kind? Are people shunning?
I think we kept it a secret for about 1.5 years because I was thinking the other day, we were just afraid. Like the night that we found that Peter had died, after everybody left the house, the three of us slept in my bed. Like we were just afraid. We were afraid of drug dealers. We were afraid of everything, needles. We were afraid of the firm. We were afraid of everybody finding out. We were ashamed that this happened, So I think for a long time, I kind of skirted over, when someone dies at 51, who seems to be at the top of their game, people will say, how did it happen? And I'd say, well, he was living a very unhealthy life. Like I came up with this like truth that wasn't the whole truth, but wasn't exactly a lie, but after a while that took a toll on me too, because I felt really depressed that I couldn't just say like, oh my God, this happened to my family. Be careful. It could be happening in yours. And so after I did tell the story in the Times, actually, I would say 98% was an outpouring of support from a lot of other spouses who had been through this with partners that had had substance abuse problems or had addictions to work, or whose marriages failed because they couldn't find some sort of balance, or the money got in the way and everybody began pursuing that instead of other things, and overconsumption, everything. So I got a lot of really great support from a variety of communities. And the legal community, surprisingly enough, I mean, I feel like that story really started a conversation in the legal community about lawyer mental health and well-being. Since Peter's death, there have been several suicides of big law lawyers that have been in the news. And certainly they just did a survey, American Lawyer Magazine, where it found that I think the numbers are up in the number of lawyers that are using substances and that are feeling depressed and anxious. Like it isn't getting better, although maybe it's the fact that people feel more able to talk about it, that those numbers are going up. It's always been something that people didn't talk about. And even Peter's law firm, although it took a while, they have been outwardly very supportive now of the book. They helped co-sponsor an event in San Diego at the Bar Association when I spoke there. And I think those are all good signs. Like, so, you know, the fact that they're having like Law Student Mental Health Day now has become an annual thing. And there's a lawyer well-being initiative and stuff, which, you know, you never used to talk about that. Nobody, you know, you didn't tell people if you were seeing a therapist, you know. So, you know, I think they're also trying to like limit things at summer associate events. It used to be a big booze festival. Now they're trying to really have like, you know, alcohol-free events and things like that. So I think you know, there's this subtle shift happening. You know, I think it's going to take a while, but that feels good.
Yeah.
But when did you want to go, Jeff?
I just want to make a comment that the article you wrote in the Times was not a typical Times article. I mean,
that's very astute. Yes.
And if for no other reason that you had photos of your family, you had a letter from your son, from your daughter to your late husband. Although at the time I guess he was still alive. I mean, it was intensely personal, and I would imagine that you had to like go ask your children's permission to do this. You had and you had to kind of explain even to editorial, like this is like not, you know, this is something that's going to be very, very revealing.
Yes, and you're right. It was a first-person piece, which is not generally the kinds of piece you do in the Sunday business section, which I'd been writing for many years. But at the time, I think my editor, they felt that this piece could really work that way, to be that way, with reporting in it, which is kind of how the book wound up. And I was very torn about the photos because they had asked for it. They thought that what it would do, it would help humanize Peter, so that he wasn't just this like rich lawyer that did the, you know, like who cares, you know. It would be like, no, this is somebody's father and son and brother and husband and ex-husband and friend. And so I was very, very torn, and I did talk to my kids about it. They were all for the piece. You know, they felt like it was important finally to like tell people like, this is happening, you should know this, and this could be happening in your family too. But I think it was hard with the photos. And when that piece came out, my daughter especially, she had a tough time. Even that letter, which she thought was a good idea at first, you know, she was 20, and afterwards I felt very conflicted. I thought, oh, should I not have done it, you know? But on the other hand, it hit home for people, and that's the point of writing it, right? I wanted to reach people, and it had an effect on them, and we got a lot of very gratifying notes. So. But it was very hard. We had quite a few talks. Nothing I did with Peter's story, I didn't first talk to my kids about it.
Yeah, my kids were the same age basically when I had my suicide attempt, and when I first saw the pictures, there's kind of not only was there an identification with my family,
sure.
But because the picture of your daughter was there.
Yeah.
And I have two daughters and a stepdaughter now. But the first thought was, even trying to be objective, they look so normal.
Yeah.
You know, like something very abnormal has happened.
And was happening right when those
exactly.
I mean, their father was dying in front of them.
Yeah.
You know? But they didn't know, and I didn't either. Yeah, It is weird, isn't it? But they seem like a normal high school senior, whatever. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Babs. You're.
Oh no, that's fine. So when you started to write this book, when did you know you wanted to write the book? How long between his passing and the idea that this is a story you wanted to tell?
Well, you know, after he died, I was still writing. I was still working as a journalist. In fact, at his funeral, I had a piece that was coming out in the Times, and in the tech section, I remember going back and forth with an editor while I was also ushering people in to the hall. So I hadn't been thinking about a book at all, but I also realized the only thing I felt like writing about was writing about what happened to Peter and me and my family. It was like the only
Mm.
story I felt like I could write before I could write anything else. I needed to kind of get it out of the way. And the more I tamped it down, the more depressed and anxious I was becoming, because I had this thing to tell and I felt like I couldn't do it. So as I was working up to the story in the New York Times, I also started fooling around with the idea of writing a memoir. And I had a prologue written and a chapter. And that summer I had gone to Aspen Summer Words, which is part of
Mhm.
the Aspen Institute's like creative writing arm. It's called Aspen Words. And was in a memoir workshop with a bunch of other people, and I had workshopped some of my stuff, and I met my agent, the woman that would become my agent there.
Mhm.
And so when we were talking in Aspen, I said, oh, I think I have a piece coming out in the Times pretty soon. And she was like, why don't we wait for that and let's stay in touch? And the weekend that came out, it went viral, and it had, like almost 2 million shares. I mean, it was like, I had never expected it.
Mhm.
And so she said, well, I think you got an audience for a book here, because I was thinking, let me see how that does. And so then we put together a proposal and sold it. So I guess it sort of happened, Babs, as I was researching the story for the New York Times. I felt like there was more there that I wanted to write and explore in a book.
Well, I have to tell you that I hate the prologue to your book. and it's not because it's not well written or well crafted, but it's like you dive in.
Yeah.
And I mean, you dive in, and I wanted to vomit.
Oh.
The first paragraph is one of those pullers right into the story.
Right. That was the point. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, of course, but it's like, I know because I've been working on a book for a while, and my prologue is kind of foreshadowing.
Sure.
There's a lot of metaphor in there built in. There's a lot of foreshadowing, but yours is like you're going like right to the crime scene. It's right there.
Going in. Yeah. Because we knew when people would pick up the book, many people would already know. I mean, it's clear this character in the book dies. So the way to kind of get people involved in it right away was to say, this was the scene, like we're right there. And now hang with me while I tell you the story. And that seemed to work.
One of the things Babs, I feel like for the last two shows I've been carrying a lot of water. I'm sorry. One of the things I'm super interested in is that I got disbarred because of my crime.
Right.
But the real proximate cause, I mean, the underlying issue was mental illness and prescription drug abuse. But back then, there were just really there was no vehicle. There was no, it just wasn't, the Bar Association wasn't sponsoring programs. I didn't feel like I wasn't self-aware enough to be able to understand my trajectory. And it led me into all kinds of terrible behavior. Yeah. So how do you parse out the fact that his behavior, although he didn't commit a white collar crime, there's still a crime involved. I mean, and that
he's using illegal drugs. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And that's not something that you really wanted to talk about, but it's kind of present because almost anybody who's in that circumstance is riding the line ethically.
Yeah, exactly. Which is why I think attorneys are so much more willing to talk about alcohol abuse, but not drug abuse, because that's illegal. And they're lawyers. They're supposed to be upholding the system of justice we have. So I think there's that conflict. Also, I think there's a certain level of like arrogance and money. Like Peter didn't have to do heroin because he could afford to buy pills. It wasn't a problem for him. Also, San Diego's really close to Mexico. So he had giant bottles of tramadol, which is an opioid painkiller, that he got in Mexico, which were probably less expensive, and he didn't need a prescription. And he could also, so he could afford to keep an expensive pill habit going, and he did. And I think it is kind of a fine line, and there is some arrogance in thinking like, I know what I'm doing. I mean, a lot of lawyers are very smart people. It's not a small thing to get your JD, and I think, it is a tough thing. I thought about it a lot, and maybe that's why his house felt like somewhat of a crime scene, and the police took all the drugs. Like, I mean, well, what they found, I found other stuff they didn't even find, but I remember asking, why did they take it? Like, what right do they have to take it? Well, I guess if you find a big rock of cocaine on someone's speaker and you're the police, you get to take it. Like. But at the time I was thinking, why are they taking things from his bedroom? Like, those aren't his things. But it's because they weren't legal, and they cleared out, all of that stuff. So I've come to understand, yeah. I mean, I guess the thought of the criminal stuff gets lost in the bigger tragedy of the fact that, like you say, this was a man who had some underlying mental health issues that were not properly addressed. He was always kind of depressed. I think he had a lot of anxiety. He once said that he knew he kind of needed like an antidepressant. And I remember saying, why don't you go? Why don't you go get it? And this was near the end of his life. We were talking about it, and he said, it's too late. He said, it's too late. And I remember thinking, no, no, it's not. You could go now. And he was like, I think we were talking about a friend of his that had gone on like Zoloft, or a very common antidepressant that works very well. And he said, I should probably be on that. And I said, why don't you go see someone? And he was like, nah, it's too late. And, all of that now feels so heavy and laden with other, information that I wasn't aware of. But
so, Babs, I very rarely ask you a question in the middle of a show, but Babs, I'm so interested in seeing how you react, because you and I both had maladaptive behavior. We did things that we probably never would have dreamed of doing, and we've devoted our lives for now well over a decade to kind of undoing that and separating ourselves and doing good works. So, I mean, how does it strike you that anybody can go over the line?
I don't understand your question.
Well, I mean, Babs, there you are.
I don't have a drug addiction or any of that. So this is a different kind of conversation for me. So I don't really know how to answer that. I would though, and this is not about me at all. I would like to know, Eileen, when you were talking to his partners, the folks at the law firm, what did they notice? What did they say about his work, his behavior? How did he show up? Was he the guy that could get things done? Did they have concerns?
They were, as you can imagine, very closed off about that. His immediate boss, this guy Jeff, did say he showed up at the house when Peter died. He said a neighbor called him. So that must have been true, or something was true, and he was alerted to the fact that there was a lot of activity around Peter's house. And he said Peter kind of stopped showing up for work for several months, saying he was working from home, but that he would be really hard to reach. And he told me that sometimes they'd be on a conference call and Peter would be not really making a lot of sense, like bringing in things that he shouldn't have been bringing into the meeting. And Jeff would try to kind of get him back on track. And I think, if I'm being generous and believing them, maybe Jeff figured he had something going on, but he didn't want to get involved. I mean, one thing he told me at the house was, I said, why didn't you pull him aside and say, what's going on? You don't seem like yourself. And he said, we don't get involved in each other's business. This is a law firm. We stay out of each other's business. But I definitely think, Babs, there was a knowledge that he was acting bizarrely, that he seemed very sick all the time. He did go to a doctor, and he did wind up diagnosed with a thyroid condition, Hashimoto's disease. And that was at the urging of the general counsel of the firm, because they were concerned about him. And then when he came back with that diagnosis, everybody seemed satisfied, but his behavior didn't get any better. And so I do think, I wonder if they were worried that there would be some liability for them. I mean, he was a very senior partner. leading cases, and in hindsight he was
So
impaired.
Eileen,
Yeah.
in your as you look back on this, do you think that the partnership could have, in hindsight, um, um, been an intervention of some sort, or created an intervention, or had an intervention that possibly could have maybe caught this somewhere down this time frame?
Babs, I feel like they should have, but they maintain that that's not their job, that it's
Mm.
not their job to intervene in anyone's personal life. I mean, I think some of them thought maybe Peter had cancer. So if you had a colleague who's losing weight and losing their hair and stuff, do you go up to them and say, like, hey, are you okay? Like, do you have cancer? It's like, I think there was no way. They felt there was no way, probably there was no system in place to do it. But I completely think, or I certainly wish, that the people that he was closest to, and he'd worked there a long time, he had friends there, had pulled him aside and said, we don't know exactly what it is, but something is off. You seem very sick. Your work is not the way it usually is. You're not up to snuff. Like, we don't know what it is, but we're here for you, and we want to help you. And we want to help you stay successful in your career and be healthy. So let us help you. He may have said no. I don't know. I've never struggled like you, but I haven't struggled with an addiction. I don't know how hard it is to let people in and let them help you. Jeff knows that. But I think that, in hindsight, I hope now that if they saw those same symptoms in an employee of theirs, they would try to intervene in some way, But I think back when Peter was struggling, I don't know how acceptable it was to even have that conversation.
But post facto, obviously, a lot of people have been willing to talk to you about this and similar problems. And even in the Times review of your book, Jay McInerney wrote the review, and he's certainly someone who carries a lot of weight, especially within the former club culture kind of now.
He knows drugs, right?
Yeah, he knows a lot about drugs, but now he's a respected middle-aged or later-aged guy,
right?
So how is it that that you have now a voice that you can reach out to other people and they're willing to share these stories with you, where that maybe they weren't otherwise willing to do? Did your article give them permission to do that?
I think so, in the way we're seeing, I mean, I can almost say the way that the political situation is in this country, when someone else publicly speaks things that you wouldn't normally say, it can be a bad thing too. You start hearing a lot of things in this way. Yeah, I think I gave voice to something that's happening and that not a lot of people want to be honest about. I think it was really important that in my memoir, I was really honest about my own failings to see things. And I think Peter, as much as it's hard to be, you go through a divorce and it's not pleasant, but I mean, I definitely loved him and he was a friend, and I feel really terrible for him that he suffered, even though he could be a pain in the neck, So I think having been really honest about it, it seems to be, I certainly get quite a bit of mail from people who feel that they can then sort of share their story with me. And I've gotten a lot of emails and notes from people that say they thought they were the only ones that this was happening to, where they thought they were the only family where their husband, who's a lawyer, is hiding his pills in the Monopoly game under the kid's bed or what, and they were really relieved to know that, like, it happened to other people and that other people were ashamed and guilty too. So, and I think the more we talk about it, the easier it is for other people to talk about it, hopefully.
One of the things that's happening with me now is kind of a poster boy of early social distancing, because nobody would talk to me.
Oh my God, that's horrible.
Well, it's kind of built in the kind of isolation of not only drug abuse, but also having been convicted of a white collar crime, where there's so much stigma and shunning and shame, that our community came together kind of based upon that. Now, a lot of people are reaching out because they're living in this kind of isolated state over the last 5 or 6 weeks.
Yeah.
And I'm hearing about a lot of themes that we've talked about for a long time, and a lot of themes in your book about people feeling kind of not able to have their usual tactile sense of the world, or their coping mechanisms. So are people reaching out to you more?
I think they're reaching out to me because they have the time, they're home, they're reading, and they're thinking about these issues. But it is interesting, because one of the things at the end of the book is, I quote a guy, Sam Quinones, who wrote this book, Dreamland, which is a great book about how the opioid crisis kind of started.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks at the end, he actually testified to Congress about this, saying that he thinks that what the antidote to the heroin epidemic or the opioid epidemic wasn't necessarily Suboxone or Narcan, it was community. And I think we have become, as much as we're connected, we're so disconnected, because what we're doing here is not a substitute for being in person, right? And for talking to somebody and having a long conversation, or a meaningful interaction, not just a text or not just an IM. And I think, I wondered how this was affecting the recovery community now, because they aren't together. And that's such a big part of kind of supporting each other and helping each other through this, and just through life. I live alone in Manhattan, and my kids are on the West Coast, and, I can't really see anybody now. I'm in the epicenter of this epidemic, and I feel like I was telling a friend last night, I said, I haven't hugged anybody in like 2 months. Like it's weird, and it's sad, and it's, it's just, it's unmooring. And I'm not struggling with a substance use issue or staying in recovery. I can't even imagine how difficult that must be right now.
And yet, there are some advantages. One example is that we might not have been able to get you up to New Haven to have this interview. But,
right, here I am.
Right, exactly. So there are hidden blessings in all of this. So
there are, and like you were saying, you can go to a lot more meetings maybe than you could have before, because there's not travel time. And exactly.
Yeah.
So Eileen, is the story done for you? How do you continue with the story? Is it done, or do you feel like you can put it to rest now?
I do feel like writing this book was a great gift for me, in kind of a selfish way, that I was able to really process it, and kind of get my head around it. And I think I think someone said, do you think you can let go of Peter now? Because writing the book, I was still kind of living in his world and with him. And now I'm not so much. And I do feel like I am ready to kind of move past it and onto something else. I'm finishing up graduate school in social work, like you mentioned, and I'm hoping to do some meaningful work in that way, and write about different things as I get older and more into that profession. So I think I am finally. Took a long time.
Did he
well,
leave
it's
it?
been a pleasure talking to you today, because we have to wrap up. We're coming to the end of this now, Jeff.
Well, it's been so nice of you to have me, and what a nice conversation.
Eileen, why don't you tell people how to get in touch with you, how to find let's plug the book. Let's plug the book.
Smacked.
Is it backwards or forwards? I can never tell on Zoom. Yours is forwards.
Backwards, right?
No, it looks forwards.
Oh, it does look forwards. Okay, yours looks forwards to me, but yes. They can reach
tell people how to find it on and your website and all of that?
If they go to my website, they can buy it on any number. I know Amazon has been busy delivering essential supplies and things, but there's a great time to support independent booksellers. You can probably get it used from people by now. So if you go to my website, my first name has an odd spelling, but it's EileenZimmerman.com, EILENE Zimmerman, ZIMMERMAN.com. The landing page has about 8 different places where you can just click and buy it, and lots of information about the book, information about book clubs. I'm happy to Zoom into those or Skype into those. And it has a list of book club questions, and it also has reader stories. So some of the mail I've gotten, I have posted up there so people can see other people's stories, some of them heartbreaking, some of them really inspiring. So please visit, and thank you so much for supporting me and other authors like me now.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Eileen. It was a pleasure having you
Yeah,
on
really
today.
So
great.
nice
Thank
to
you.
meet you guys. Thank
And,
you so much.
Thank you to the Community Foundation of Greater New Haven who made Criminal Justice Insider possible.
We are
Good to
grateful.
see you, Jeff.
Yeah, Babs, another Zoom criminal justice insider under our belt.
Well, hopefully we'll get back to talking about criminal justice. So thank you so much. Harry, play us out.